The candles in the ballroom went out all at once, and for 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. Duke Edward Ashworth froze, with his hand still raised toward the orchestra, ready to signal the next dance, when the darkness swallowed the entire hall. Someone screamed near the west windows. Glasses shattered against the marble floor, and in that pitch-black moment, before the servants could relight a single flame, Edward felt a small, cold hand grip his wrist and pull him hard to the left, away from where he had been standing only a heartbeat before. A vase crashed exactly where his feet had been. When the candles came back to life one by one, Edward turned to see who had saved him, expecting a footman or a guard. Instead, he found a young woman he barely recognized, standing perfectly still, her hand still wrapped around his wrist, her eyes scanning the balcony above the ballroom, as if she expected something else to fall. "You should thank the wind," she said quietly, letting go of him at once. It knocked over the flower stand on the balcony. I saw it tilt before the candles went out. Edward stared at her. She was not one of the celebrated beauties of the evening. She wore a simple gray dress with no jewels, and she had been sitting in the far corner all night, sketching in a small leather notebook while the rest of the guests danced and gossiped. He had noticed her earlier, briefly, the way one notices a single quiet note in a loud symphony, and then he had forgotten her, because his mother had already steered him toward the eldest daughter of the Hart family. "You saw it before it fell?" he asked. "In the dark?" "I watch things," she said simply. "It is a habit. My name is Eleanor Hart." Hart. Edward's stomach turned slightly. This quiet woman with the sharp eyes was the younger sister of Isabel Hart, the woman his mother had already decided would become the next Duchess of Ashworth. He had met Isabel only an hour earlier, and she had been dazzling, full of laughter and clever remarks, the kind of woman every man in the room wanted to be seen beside. He had not even known she had a sister until this moment. "Thank you," he said, still shaken. "You may have just saved my life." "It was only a vase," Eleanor said, and there was the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. Though I suppose a vase to the skull could end a man's evening rather badly. Before Edward could answer, his mother appeared at his side, her face full of relief and irritation in equal measure. "Edward, thank heavens. Come, Isabel is waiting." She was so frightened by the commotion. The Duchess mother barely glanced at Eleanor, murmuring a distracted word of thanks before pulling her son away toward the center of the room, where Isabel Hart stood, surrounded by admirers, her golden hair catching the restored candlelight perfectly. Edward allowed himself to be led away, but as he crossed the floor, he looked back once. Eleanor Hart had already returned to her corner, picked up her fallen notebook, and resumed her quiet sketching, as though nothing at all had happened, as though she had not just pulled a duke out of the path of a falling vase and prevented an injury, or worse, in front of 200 witnesses who had not even noticed. Nobody in that ballroom would remember what Eleanor Hart did that night. Edward would never forget it. The rest of the evening passed in the usual blur of introductions and careful conversation. Isabel Hart was every bit as charming as his mother had promised. She spoke of poetry with real enthusiasm. She laughed at his jokes with genuine warmth, and when she looked at him, her eyes held an open, easy admiration that most men would have found irresistible. Edward tried to give himself fully to the conversation, tried to feel the pull that his mother assured him he would feel toward this woman, who could solve every financial worry that had haunted the Ashworth estate for the past 3 years. But his eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room, where Eleanor sat with her notebook, occasionally glancing up to study the crowd with the same careful attention she had used to spot a falling vase in the dark. She did not dance. She did not seek attention. She seemed content to watch, to observe, to remain invisible, while her sister collected every eye in the room. "You are staring at my sister," Isabel said suddenly, not unkindly, following his gaze. Edward felt heat rise in his neck. "Forgive me. She helped me avoid an accident earlier." "I was simply grateful." "Eleanor is always noticing things nobody else sees," Isabel said, and there was something careful in her tone, something Edward could not quite name. "She has always been the clever one. I am the pretty one. That is how our mother used to say it, when we were children. It became rather true, I am afraid." "I do not think that is a fair way to speak of your own sister," Edward said before he could stop himself. Isabel blinked, clearly surprised by the mild correction, and then she laughed, a bright, practiced sound. "You are kind to defend her." Most men do not even remember her name by the end of the evening. Edward said nothing further on the subject, though the comment stayed with him longer than he expected. He danced 2 more dances with Isabel, complimented her on her wit, and allowed his mother to beam with satisfaction from across the room. By the time the carriage rolled him home that night, the arrangement between the 2 families had already begun to take shape in everyone's mind, spoken of in the confident, settled way that people speak of things already decided. Yet as Edward lay awake in his bedchamber, staring at the dark ceiling, it was not Isabel's laughter he heard replaying in his mind. It was the low, steady voice of a woman in a gray dress, telling him to thank the wind, her hand cold and firm around his wrist, pulling him out of danger, without a trace of panic in her voice. He told himself it meant nothing, a moment of shock, nothing more. A quiet observer had simply been paying more attention than anyone else in a crowded room, and it happened to save him from a bruised shoulder or worse. That was all. By morning, he assured himself, he would think of Isabel Hart, the woman who would become his wife, the woman who would save his family's name and fortune with her dowry and her charm. But morning came, and the memory of Eleanor's steady eyes had not faded at all. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, refusing to be pushed aside no matter how firmly Edward tried to direct his thoughts toward duty, toward the future that had already been chosen for him, before he had even understood there might be another path worth considering. He did not yet know that this single moment in the dark, this small act of quiet courage from a woman nobody else had noticed, would become the first thread in a much larger and more difficult story, one that would test everything he believed about duty, about love, and about the difference between choosing what was expected and choosing what was true. For now, he only knew that he could not stop thinking about the corner of the room where she had been sitting, and the strange, unsettling comfort of being truly seen by someone who wanted nothing from him at all. 3 days after the ball, Edward received a formal invitation to dine with the Hart family at their country house, a clear signal from his mother that the courtship of Isabel was to begin in earnest. He dressed carefully, rehearsed pleasant conversation topics in his mind during the carriage ride, and arrived determined to give Isabel his full and undivided attention, as any sensible man in his position would do. The Hart estate was smaller than his own, but well kept, with gardens that spoke of quiet effort rather than extravagant display. Isabel greeted him at the door herself, radiant in a blue gown that matched her eyes, and led him through to the drawing room, where her parents waited, with the practiced warmth of people, eager to secure an advantageous match for their daughter. Dinner was pleasant enough. Isabel spoke at length about a novel she had recently read, about her plans to redecorate a townhouse she hoped to one day have in the city, about a charity event she wished to organize for the wives of soldiers. She was clever and articulate, and Edward found himself genuinely enjoying her company, even as a small, persistent voice in the back of his mind kept wondering where her sister had gone. Eleanor did not appear at dinner at all. It was only afterward, while Isabel excused herself briefly to attend to a household matter, that Edward wandered by mistake into a narrow hallway lined with old portraits, searching for the drawing room he had left only minutes before. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall, and through it came the soft rustle of turning pages. He should have turned back. He knew, even as he approached the door, that propriety demanded he return to the drawing room and wait for Isabel. But curiosity, or something stronger than curiosity, pulled him forward until he stood at the threshold of a small library, its shelves crowded with books that looked well used rather than merely decorative. Eleanor sat curled in a window seat, a heavy volume open across her knees, entirely unaware of his presence. The late afternoon light caught the side of her face, and for a moment, Edward simply watched her, struck by how different she looked, away from the noise and performance of a crowded room. Here, she seemed entirely herself, unguarded, absorbed completely in whatever she was reading. "Forgive the intrusion," he said finally, and she startled, nearly dropping the book. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly, though there was none of the flustered excitement most young women showed in his presence. "I did not expect to see you wandering the halls unattended." "I confess, I became lost searching for the drawing room," he admitted, feeling suddenly foolish. "What are you reading, if I may ask?" She hesitated, as though deciding whether the question deserved a real answer or a polite deflection. Then, surprising him, she turned the book toward him. It was a treatise on astronomy, dense with diagrams and careful notations in the margins written in her own hand. "You study the stars?" he asked, unable to hide his surprise. "I study many things nobody expects a young woman to study," Eleanor said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a plain, steady honesty. "It amuses my mother to let me have my books, so long as I do not embarrass the family by mentioning them in polite company. My sister shines in the drawing room. I am permitted to shine here instead, where no one is watching." "I am watching now," Edward said quietly, and immediately regretted how the words sounded. Too direct, too revealing of the thoughts he had been trying to suppress since the night of the ball. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You are courting my sister, Your Grace. I would advise you to remember that, for both our sakes." The words were gentle, but they landed with the precision of a closed door. Edward felt the rebuke fairly, and he nodded, understanding that she was not merely stating a fact, but drawing a boundary, protecting something, perhaps her sister, perhaps herself, perhaps both. "You are right, of course," he said. "I apologize if I have overstepped." "You have not," Eleanor said, softening slightly. "You are simply a man who notices things, in a family that has spent a great deal of effort teaching people not to notice me. It is not your fault that you noticed anyway." Before Edward could find a suitable response, footsteps approached down the hall, and Isabel's voice called his name, bright and cheerful, wondering where he had wandered off to. Eleanor closed her book at once, and stepped back into the shadow of the window seat, as though preparing to disappear again, to return to the quiet corner where the world seemed to expect her to remain. "Your Grace," she said, one final time, with a small, formal nod, and then Isabel appeared in the doorway, linking her arm through his, with easy familiarity, and the moment was gone. Edward spent the rest of the evening in Isabel's company, laughing at her stories, admiring her plans, allowing himself to be charmed, as any reasonable man would be. But when the carriage finally carried him home that night, it was the astronomy book he thought of, and the steady, unguarded voice of a woman who studied the stars in private because the world had decided she was not meant to shine anywhere else. He told himself again, more firmly this time, that this fascination would fade. He was a duke with a family name to protect, an estate burdened with debt, and a mother who had already begun planning a wedding that would solve every practical problem he faced. Isabel Hart was clever, beautiful, and willing. She would make an excellent duchess, admired by all of society, exactly the kind of wife a man in his position was supposed to want. And yet, as he closed his eyes that night, it was not Isabel's laughter that followed him into sleep. It was the image of Eleanor curled in a window seat, with starlight diagrams spread across her knees, entirely herself, entirely unnoticed by a world too busy admiring her sister to see what she truly was. He did not yet understand what that feeling meant, or where it would lead him. He only knew, with a growing unease he could not quite name, that the path laid out so carefully before him no longer felt as simple as it once had, and that a woman in the corner of a room had somehow, without ever raising her voice, begun to change everything he thought he knew about what he wanted from his life. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm of visits, dinners, and carefully orchestrated public appearances between Edward and Isabel. Society noticed quickly, as society always does, and whispers of an impending engagement began to circulate through every drawing room and ballroom in the county. Edward's mother could not have been more pleased, and Isabel herself seemed to glow under the attention, blossoming further with each passing week into the role everyone expected her to fill. Edward, for his part, tried earnestly to give himself over to the courtship. He brought Isabel flowers she admired, escorted her to concerts she requested, and listened patiently as she described in vivid detail the kind of household she hoped to run once they were married. She was, by every reasonable measure, a delightful companion, and Edward reminded himself often of how fortunate he was to have secured the affection of a woman so universally admired. Yet each visit to the Hart estate carried with it a quiet, persistent hope that he tried and failed to suppress, a small hope that he might catch even a brief glimpse of Eleanor somewhere in the house, a fleeting exchange in a hallway, a moment of unguarded conversation before duty called him back to Isabel's side. More often than not, Eleanor remained absent from these visits entirely, as though she had made a deliberate choice to remove herself from any situation where their paths might cross again. Edward told himself this was for the best. He was wrong to think it would be so easily settled, and he suspected, deep down, that the growing tightness in his chest whenever he thought of the quiet woman with the astronomy book was not something that would simply fade with time and distraction, no matter how determinedly he tried to bury it beneath the demands of duty and the comfortable, practiced charm of the sister he was expected to marry. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday evening, rolling in from the western hills so quickly that the sky turned from pale gold to bruised gray in the space of an hour. Edward had traveled to the Hart estate for what was meant to be a brief visit, a small family dinner to discuss wedding preparations that had already begun in earnest, but by the time dessert was served, rain hammered against the windows with such force that his coachman refused to risk the roads until morning. "You must stay the night, Your Grace," Mr. Hart insisted, waving away Edward's polite protests. "No sense risking an accident on those winding roads in this weather. We have more than enough rooms." Isabel seemed delighted by the arrangement, already imagining the romantic novelty of an unplanned overnight stay, but the excitement of the evening wore on her quickly. By 9:30, she confessed to a headache brought on by the tension of hosting, and excused herself to bed, leaving her parents to retire shortly after, satisfied that their future son-in-law was safely settled for the night. Edward found himself alone in the drawing room, restless and unable to sleep, the storm outside far too loud for quiet rest. He wandered toward the library out of habit more than intention, and there, exactly as he had half hoped and half feared, he found Eleanor sitting by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the storm through the tall windows with the same careful attention she gave to everything. "You are not asleep either," she observed, without turning her head. "The storm is too loud," Edward said, taking a seat across from her, close enough for conversation, but careful to maintain a respectful distance. "And perhaps my mind is too full." "Wedding plans can do that to a person," Eleanor said, and there was no edge in her voice, only quiet understanding. "Isabel has been talking of little else for weeks, flowers and music, and which cousins must be seated where." "Does it trouble you?" Edward asked, before he could stop himself. "Watching your sister prepare for a marriage that will change everything for your family?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider everything, weighing her words with the same careful precision she used to watch a falling vase or study a star chart. "It does not trouble me that she is happy. I only wonder, sometimes, whether happiness built on the right appearance is the same as happiness built on the right foundation. But that is not my decision to make, nor yours to answer for, Your Grace." "You may call me Edward," he said quietly, "at least when we are alone like this." "That would not be proper," Eleanor said, though something in her expression softened, as though the offer meant more to her than she wished to admit. They talked for hours after that, the storm raging outside providing a strange kind of privacy neither of them had planned for. Eleanor spoke of her fascination with the stars, how she had once tried to calculate the distance to a comet, using nothing but a borrowed telescope and a mathematics book she had taken from her father's study. Edward spoke of the weight of his title, the debts he had inherited, alongside his father's name, the quiet fear that he would fail the tenants and servants who depended on the Ashworth estate for their livelihoods. He told her things he had never told Isabel, things he had barely admitted to himself. And Eleanor listened, really listened, asking questions that showed she understood the shape of his worries, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. It was, Edward realized somewhere near dawn, the first conversation he had shared with anyone in years that had not felt like a performance. "You are easy to talk to," he admitted, as the first gray light of morning began to creep through the windows, the storm finally spent. "Perhaps that is because I do not want anything from you," Eleanor said simply. "People rarely say true things to those they are trying to impress." Edward wanted, in that quiet gray morning, to reach across the small distance between them and take her hand the way she had once taken his wrist in the dark. He wanted to tell her that he had not thought of anyone else so completely in all the weeks since the ball, that her steady presence had become something he looked for in every room he entered. But the words remained trapped in his chest, held back by the enormous weight of everything already set in motion, the engagement announcements already drafted, his mother's careful plans, the debts that Isabel's dowry would finally settle. He said nothing, he only rose, thanked her for the conversation, and returned to his room before the household stirred, carrying with him a feeling he could no longer pretend was simple curiosity, or fleeting fascination. It was something far more dangerous than that, and he knew it, even as he tried desperately to convince himself otherwise. In the days that followed the storm, Edward threw himself into the practical business of the engagement, with a determination that surprised even his own mother. He met with lawyers to review the marriage settlement, approved wedding invitations without complaint, and accompanied Isabel to appointments with dressmakers and florists, nodding along to her plans with what he hoped looked like genuine enthusiasm. He avoided the Hart Estates library entirely on his visits, taking careful routes through the house that kept him far from the quiet room where Eleanor spent her hours. He told himself this was wisdom, not cowardice, that a man about to marry one woman had no business seeking conversation with her sister, however comfortable that conversation might feel. Duty, he reminded himself again and again, was the foundation upon which his family's future had always been built, and duty did not bend for feelings that could not be spoken aloud, without shattering everything around them. Eleanor, for her part, seemed to sense the sudden distance and did not attempt to close it. She grew quieter still during the rare moments their paths crossed at family gatherings, offering only polite, formal greetings, before retreating into whatever task or book occupied her attention. If she felt anything about his withdrawal, she gave no outward sign of it, and Edward told himself this was proof that the storm night conversation had meant nothing more to her than a pleasant way to pass a sleepless evening. He was wrong about this, though he would not understand how wrong for some time yet. The engagement between Edward and Isabel was formally announced at a grand garden party hosted by the Ashworth family, attended by every notable family in the county. Isabel wore a gown of pale ivory silk that drew gasps of admiration as she walked among the guests on Edward's arm, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. Edward smiled and shook hands and thanked well-wishers throughout the afternoon, playing his part in the celebration with the same careful composure he brought to every public duty. It was only near the end of the party, as the guests began to disperse into the fading afternoon light, that Edward caught sight of Eleanor standing near the edge of the garden, half hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses, watching the celebration from a careful distance. Their eyes met across the crowded lawn for the briefest moment, and Edward saw something in her expression that he had never seen there before, something carefully guarded but unmistakable. A flicker of quiet sorrow quickly smoothed away behind a polite, distant smile. She turned and walked back toward the house before he could cross the lawn to speak with her, and Edward stood rooted in place, Isabel's hand still resting lightly on his arm, feeling as though the ground beneath his carefully constructed future had just shifted in some fundamental and irreversible way. "Is something troubling you?" Isabel asked, following his gaze toward the empty space where her sister had stood only moments before. "No," Edward said, forcing a smile onto his face. "Nothing at all." But the lie sat uneasily in his chest for the rest of the evening, and long after the last guest had departed, he found himself standing alone in his study, staring out at the darkening garden, wondering how a man could feel so completely certain about his duty, and so entirely uncertain about his heart, at the very same moment. The wedding preparations continued through the summer, with the relentless momentum of an event that had already gathered too much energy to be stopped by anything so small as private doubt. Seamstresses arrived weekly, with fittings for Isabel's gown. Menus were tasted and approved. Guest lists grew longer, as distant relatives and society acquaintances secured their invitations to what promised to be one of the most celebrated weddings the county had seen in a decade. Edward played his role dutifully, but a quiet unease had settled into him that would not lift no matter how busy he kept himself. It began with small things, moments he might once have overlooked entirely, had his attention not already been sharpened by his conversations with Eleanor. He noticed, for instance, the way Isabel's warmth toward the household staff seemed to depend entirely on who was watching. In front of guests, she thanked the servants with bright, generous smiles. Alone with them, her tone grew clipped and impatient, correcting small mistakes with a sharpness that surprised him. He told himself, at first, that everyone had moments of frustration, that no person could maintain perfect grace in every private circumstance, but the pattern repeated itself too often to dismiss entirely. During one visit, he arrived early and found Isabel scolding a young maid over a wrinkled tablecloth with a coldness that seemed entirely at odds with the warm, laughing woman who charmed every drawing room she entered. More troubling still was the way Isabel spoke of her sister when she believed no one of consequence was listening. At a family dinner, when Eleanor mentioned a book she had been reading about the movement of planets, Isabel laughed lightly and remarked to the other guests that her sister collected strange hobbies the way other women collected ribbons, a comment delivered with a smile but carrying an unmistakable edge of dismissal. Eleanor said nothing in response, simply lowered her eyes to her plate, and Edward felt something tighten uncomfortably in his chest at the casual cruelty of the remark, and the practiced way Eleanor absorbed it without complaint, as though she had received such comments her entire life, and had long ago stopped expecting anything different. "You are quiet tonight," Isabel observed later, once the guests had departed, and they sat together in the drawing room, reviewing final details for the ceremony. "I was thinking about your sister," Edward admitted, choosing his words with care. "You spoke rather sharply of her interests at dinner." Isabel's expression flickered with mild surprise, quickly smoothed into practiced amusement. "Eleanor does not mind. She has always been the serious one. She would rather bury her nose in a book than enjoy an evening among company. It is simply how she is." "Perhaps she has never been given much reason to expect anything else," Edward said quietly. Isabel studied him for a long moment, something calculating entering her gaze that Edward had not seen from her before. A brief crack in the polished warmth she presented so effortlessly to the world. "You seem rather concerned with my sister's feelings lately, Edward. Should I be worried?" "Of course not," Edward said quickly, perhaps too quickly, and Isabel's smile returned, though it did not quite reach her eyes this time. The conversation ended there, but it left Edward with a growing, uncomfortable clarity that had been building slowly for weeks. He had chosen Isabel because she was exactly what everyone expected him to choose: the clever, beautiful, socially perfect match that would solve every practical problem his family faced. But he was beginning to understand that the version of Isabel presented to the world, warm and generous and endlessly charming, existed alongside another version entirely, one reserved for those who held no power over her reputation, a version that could be careless with cruelty when she believed the cost would never be counted against her. He thought of Eleanor's steady honesty, her refusal to perform for anyone, her willingness to say true things, even when they were uncomfortable. He thought of how she had pulled him from danger, without seeking praise for it, how she had spoken to him about the stars and his fears with a clarity no one else in his life had ever offered him, and he began to wonder, with a dread that grew heavier by the day, whether he had spent months courting the wrong sister entirely, mistaking polish for substance and charm for character, in a decision that would bind him for the rest of his life to a woman he was only now beginning to truly understand. The wedding was 3 weeks away, the invitations already sent, the church already reserved, his mother already fitted for her own gown for the occasion. And yet Edward found himself lying awake each night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there remained any honest way to undo a decision that the entire world now considered settled beyond question. 10 days before the wedding, Edward found an excuse to visit the Hart estate alone, claiming a matter of business with Mr. Hart that could easily have waited or been settled by letter. His true purpose, one he barely admitted even to himself during the carriage ride, was to see Eleanor once more, before the wedding closed every remaining door between them for good. He found her in the garden rather than the library, kneeling beside a bed of late summer flowers, her sleeves pushed up and her hands dark with soil, entirely unconcerned with the impropriety of a duke discovering her in such an unpolished state. She looked up at his approach with mild surprise, quickly followed by the same careful, guarded expression she had worn since the garden party months before. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing the dirt from her hands. "I did not expect a visit so close to the wedding. Isabel is in the village with our mother, choosing ribbons for the final decorations, I believe." "I did not come to see Isabel," Edward said quietly, and watched Eleanor go still. "Then I am not certain what business you have with me," she said carefully, though her eyes betrayed her, flickering with something she could not quite hide. "I owe you an apology," Edward said. "I have kept my distance from you these past months, and I did so poorly and unfairly, without ever explaining why. You deserved better than my silence." Eleanor's expression did not soften easily. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. You are engaged to my sister. Whatever passed between us, whatever conversations we shared, they belong to a night that circumstances forced upon us both. I have not mistaken them for anything more than that." "Have you not?" Edward asked, and the directness of the question seemed to startle her. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing at all, her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder, toward the garden gate, toward the road that led back toward the house, where her sister would soon return with ribbons and wedding plans, and the certainty of a future already secured. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, some carefully controlled emotion held tightly in check. "I will not pretend I felt nothing," she said. "That would be a lie, and I have tried very hard, my whole life, not to lie about what I feel, even when honesty costs me more than silence would. But I will also not become someone's quiet regret, Edward. I will not be the woman a man thinks of fondly, while he lives a different life with someone else entirely, comforting himself with the idea that he once knew something real, while never once being brave enough to choose it." Her words landed with the force of a closed fist, precise and unflinching, exactly the kind of honesty Edward had come to associate with her, the kind Isabel's polished charm had never once offered him. "If you want something," Eleanor continued, "you must choose it plainly, and pay whatever cost that choosing demands. You cannot have both the comfortable path and the true one. The world does not permit that kind of arrangement, however much we might wish it did." "And if I choose it?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I come to you honestly, and give up everything the world expects of me, what then?" Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, her guarded expression cracking just slightly to reveal the depth of feeling she had spent months carefully hiding away. "Then you would need to be certain, Edward, certain enough to face my family's anger, certain enough to face the scandal that would follow, certain enough to know that this is not simply the excitement of wanting what you cannot have, because I will not survive being chosen halfway. I would rather remain in my corner with my books and my stars than become a mistake you regret in 6 months' time." The weight of her words settled over him fully in that quiet garden, the late summer sun casting long shadows across the flower beds she had been tending only minutes before. Edward understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he stood at the edge of a decision that would define the rest of his life, one that no amount of careful planning or dutiful obligation could resolve for him. He would have to choose, honestly and completely, between the life that had been arranged for him and the life he had only just begun to understand he truly wanted. "Give me until the wedding day," he said finally. "I owe your sister the truth before I owe anyone else anything at all. She deserves better than being left uncertain, and so do you." Eleanor nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "Then I will wait, Edward, but only until then. After that, whatever happens, I intend to build my own life, with or without you in it." He left the garden that afternoon, carrying the full weight of a decision he could no longer avoid, understanding at last that the 10 days remaining before his wedding would determine not only his own future, but the futures of 2 sisters whose lives had been shaped, in very different ways, by a family and a society that had decided long ago which one of them deserved to shine. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, the kind of golden summer day that seemed almost cruelly perfect for the ceremony everyone had spent months preparing. The church filled with guests, dressed in their finest clothes, the air thick with the scent of flowers arranged by Isabel's own careful hand, every detail exactly as it had been planned since the engagement was first announced at the garden party months before. Edward stood at the front of the church in his formal attire, his heart pounding with a certainty he had never expected to feel on this particular morning. Not the certainty of a man about to marry the woman of his dreams, but the heavy, unshakable certainty of a decision he could no longer postpone or avoid. He had spent the 10 days since the garden conversation in careful, quiet thought, weighing every consequence, imagining every version of the life that lay ahead of him, depending on the choice he made. He had come to understand something during those quiet days of reflection that he wished he had understood months earlier, before invitations were sent and gowns were fitted, and an entire county had gathered its expectations around an event that suddenly felt less like the beginning of his own life and more like the fulfillment of everyone else's plans for him. He had chosen Isabel because she represented safety, practicality, and the easy approval of society and family alike. But safety, he had come to realize, was not the same as truth, and practicality could not replace the rare, steady honesty he had found in a quiet corner of a library, in a garden full of late summer flowers, in a woman who had never once tried to be anything other than exactly herself. Isabel entered the church on her father's arm, radiant in her ivory gown, exactly as beautiful as everyone had always known she would be on this day. Edward watched her walk toward him, and felt, for the first time in months, complete clarity about what he needed to do, however painful, however scandalous, however much it would upset the careful arrangements that had brought them all to this church on this particular morning. When Isabel reached the front of the church, Edward stepped forward and, before the priest could begin the ceremony, asked quietly for a private word with his bride, a request that sent a ripple of confused murmurs through the assembled guests. In a small side room, away from the eyes of the gathered crowd, Edward spoke honestly, for the first time in their entire courtship. He told Isabel, gently but plainly, that he had come to understand his feelings had changed, that he could not in good conscience marry her, while his heart belonged so completely to someone else, and that she deserved a husband whose devotion matched the warmth she had shown him throughout their engagement, rather than a man harboring divided loyalties on his wedding day. Isabel's reaction was, in its own way, revealing of everything Edward had come to understand about her these past months. Her initial shock gave way quickly to anger, not the anger of heartbreak, but the sharper, colder anger of wounded pride, of a carefully planned future suddenly and publicly disrupted. She spoke of scandal, of ruined reputation, of the humiliation he would bring upon her family, in front of every notable guest in the county. She did not, notably, speak of a broken heart, and Edward understood in that moment that he had made the right decision, however difficult its consequences would prove to be. The wedding did not proceed that day. What followed instead was several months of difficult, uncomfortable scandal, exactly as Isabel had predicted, whispered conversations in every drawing room, disapproving letters from Edward's mother, and a period of social isolation that tested Edward's resolve in ways he had not fully anticipated. But through all of it, he found himself steadied by a growing certainty that had nothing to do with practicality or family expectation, and everything to do with the quiet, unwavering honesty of the woman who had once pulled him from the path of a falling vase in a darkened ballroom. Eleanor did not make his path easy, nor did she rush toward him the moment the engagement to her sister ended. She insisted, true to her word, on time and certainty, before allowing herself to trust that his change of heart was real and lasting, rather than a passing rebellion against the life that had been chosen for him. It took the better part of a year, filled with careful conversations, quiet visits, and the slow rebuilding of trust between two families, torn apart by scandal, before Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe that Edward's choice had been made honestly and completely. They were married eventually, in a small, quiet ceremony, attended by far fewer guests than the grand wedding originally planned, held not in the fashionable church favored by society, but in the small chapel near the Hart estate, surrounded by close family and the handful of friends who had stood by them both through the difficult months of scandal and uncertainty. Isabel did not attend, having by then found her own path forward with a wealthy merchant who admired precisely the polished charm Edward had once mistaken for genuine warmth. Eleanor wore a simple gown on her wedding day, without elaborate decoration, much like the gray dress she had worn the night of the ball where their story began. And as Edward watched her walk toward him through the small chapel, he understood with complete certainty that he had finally chosen correctly, not the path that society expected, nor the life that solved every practical problem with the least resistance, but the quiet, honest connection that had been waiting patiently in the corner of every room he had ever entered, since the night a stranger's steady hand had pulled him safely out of the dark. They built a life together that few in society fully understood, one built on late-night conversations about stars and books, on honest disagreements openly spoken, rather than smoothed over with practiced charm, on a partnership that valued substance over appearance in every decision they made together. The Ashworth estate recovered slowly through careful management rather than a fortunate marriage, and Edward found, to his quiet satisfaction, that a harder path, chosen honestly, brought him far greater peace than an easier path chosen out of duty ever could have. And though society continued for years afterward to whisper about the Duke who had chosen the lovely sister and then abandoned her at the altar for the quiet one nobody had ever noticed, Edward never once regretted the choice that had cost him so much and given him, in return, everything that had truly mattered all along.